So quick show of hands, how many of you want more success in your lives? Hold it up high. How many want more happiness? Awesome. Well, unfortunately, I can deliver neither of those, but if I know anything, when you bring like-minded people together, great things will happen, so you guys are in the right place. Before I get going too much further, I'm going to ask if you guys got one of these in your pockets, pull it out. An Android device or iOS. If you have a BlackBerry, sorry to hear. Hold it up high. What I'm going to ask is, for the next 25, 30 minutes, is for your divided attention. So it's okay to blue face a little bit. If you hear anything interesting, find that I look funny or that my hair is a little too spiky, take a picture, put it on Instagram. Hashtag is BigKC. I think the best thing we can do for community building is tell our stories. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about kind of some beliefs I have as an entrepreneur. Oh, there we go. Some beliefs that have guided my life around getting and staying motivated, how to create a support network, and finally I'm going to end with a very personal story of one of the best entrepreneurs I've ever met. So as Jason mentioned, I'm Canadian. So can you guys help me if I say things like about or a, or unfortunately sorry, could you please not laugh or snicker, because it really throws me off. So I've been fortunate enough over the past few years to live in San Francisco, build companies, raise venture capital, had a couple exits, invested in other amazing, passionate entrepreneurs. And now I'm working on a new startup called Clarity that helps business owners and professionals find, schedule, and pay for expert advice to grow their business. And we launched it about 11 months ago, and we've already completed 13,000 calls across 50 different countries, and we're just getting started. I also want to start off by thanking Jeff and Caleb and Reagan and Dusty and all the sponsors for putting this great event together. Let's give them a big round of applause. So one of my first beliefs is don't listen to your parents. It's funny, every time my dad hears about my talks, he's like, I don't like that one. That's bad. And I'm like, but you know, it's funny because like I think a lot of people starting off, they don't get the support that they want from their parents or their friends or really, you know, anybody. And here's what I learned. It's actually really normal. And what I realized was, you know, as a person trying to do something, somebody that they care about, the last thing they want to see is for you to fall down and hurt yourself. Right? When you're a kid and they're teaching how to ride your bike, you know, they're holding on to that back seat. They don't want to let go. And what they're thinking about, and it's not that they're trying to push down your dreams, they're essentially trying to give you guidance so hopefully you don't fall. And you know, when I graduated college, I got my first job. It's the first and only job I ever had when I was about 19. And I worked there for 11 months. But one day I remember going into work and just realizing like, holy shit, if I keep doing this, I'm going to wake up in like 20 years and wonder where my life went. So I got inspired that night, and the next day I went into work, and I decided to quit. But I was going to be a good employee and give them a month's notice. And my boss was like, okay, so you're going to be done. I was like, I just got to go out west. I got to go see what else this world holds, you know, might hold for me, and I just got to go. I hope you're okay with that. And my boss was cool. So that night I went home. Next day I come back to work, and HR pulls me into the office and pretty much says, I'm fired. So a short lesson there is don't resign until you're actually ready to do it, because they might decide against your will that they don't need you. But I slowly convinced them that I was just, I had a lapse of judgment and that wasn't the case, and I still wanted to work there. I had to pay off my line of credit, my student loan, and all these other things I was planning on doing. So they let me stay, and 2 weeks later I resigned. But I didn't tell my dad until that last day of work, and I remember calling up my dad and saying, you know, Dad, I really want to go see what the world has for me. I think, you know, going out west, and this was August of 2001. And he's on the other line of the phone, he's listening. My dad's very patient, doesn't say a whole lot. And all of a sudden he comes out with, that is the worst thing you've ever done in your life. And you don't understand the kind of stuff I did as a young kid. So I was like, holy crap, that must have been, you know, he had some pretty strong feelings about that. But I told him I had to go see. And September 8, 2001, I decided to drive across out west. I sold everything in my apartment, paid off my line of credit, my credit cards, and packed up my 1987 Volkswagen Jetta full to the trunk with 2 mountain bikes on the roof and made my way out west. And halfway across, before I left, there was all these opportunities and technology, and halfway across, driving across the country, 9/11 happened. And I end up in Calgary, and the whole market, anybody in the technology space, in 2001, everything just froze. All the opportunities I had for employment, all the opportunities I had, in that city essentially dried up, and I had to eventually couch surf amongst all my friends. And I did that for 3 months. I was determined there's no freaking way that I'm gonna call up my dad and ask him for any money. So here's a quick lesson there, is always ask for money when you don't need it. Because I thought I was really smart by paying off my line of credit and student loans, and all of a sudden when I needed the money, I didn't have a job and nobody wanted to give it to me. Luckily I had some very supportive friends. And one day I get a call from this recruiter, and they're like, hey, I have a client that's looking for somebody with your skills. It happened that the job I had, that only one job, they set me on some training, and I was like this only guy in Canada that knew this technology. And they said, they're looking for somebody to go live up north, like way up north, like where the sun doesn't set in the summertime, like really, really up in the province in this place called Fort McMurray. And they said they're looking for somebody to run their technical team. I was 21. I was like, yeah, I could do that. So she makes the introduction over email. We schedule a call. And I'm talking to the hiring manager, Darcy. And Darcy's asking me these really technical questions. I just happen to have the good answer. And he really liked the interview. And I get a call back from the recruiter and says, you got the job. And I was like amazed. Like I was like so happy because I'd been unemployed for 3 months and about a week away from going back home. So 2 weeks later, I fly up to this place. And you got to understand, I wasn't like, back in the day, I was kind of like an introverted geek. I didn't really talk to many people. So I was like dressed in like khakis with a plaid shirt, hung out, and, Chuck sneakers. And they were doing this offsite with their whole technical team at this big oil company, and they said to meet there. And when I show up, I kind of knock on the door, and this guy, Darcy, comes, and he looks at me, and I could just tell in his face something was wrong. And he introduces me to the group. There's about 30 people in this room. And I sit down, and at the break, he pulls me aside. And he starts to say, Dan, I've got to apologize. I didn't realize at the time, I should have, but I didn't realize how young you were. I never asked. And honestly, like, as you can see, everybody else in this room is 20, 30 years old, and we're looking for somebody to lead the team. And he goes, I don't want to send you home today, but the best thing I can say is you've got 2 weeks to prove yourself. So I did the first thing I thought I could do was get a library card. Does anybody know what a library card? When's the last time anybody's seen a library card? So I got a library card and quickly started learning things like project management and technical architecture and all these things, creating a Gantt chart. Does anybody know what a Gantt chart is? Exactly. Like I haven't done one since that job, but I needed to learn these things to prove myself. And after 2 weeks, I thought for sure I was getting fired. There's no way that he would keep me around. And Darcy came in my office, shut the door, and said, I'm really impressed. Let's keep this going. And that job changed my life because they weren't hiring people full-time. They were only looking for contractors. I ended up being a contractor for 2 years, saving every penny that they paid me and living off of only what I needed. And that money that I saved up was the seed capital that I used to start my next venture, Spheric Technologies. And it's funny because like even today when my dad sees me in the news and stuff, he still kind of shakes his head and smiles and he goes, I'm really glad you didn't listen to me. And I said, I don't, but I love you and I know why you do it. So hopefully you guys can understand when your parents are giving you a hard time, it's not because they don't believe in your dreams, they just don't want to see you screw up and hurt yourself. So it comes from a good place. So before, let's see if we can get the audio on my slides, but there's this thing that people talk about passion in entrepreneurship. You have to have passion. I totally agree with that. But nobody ever explained it like this next guy, probably one of the best entrepreneurs, in my view, in the world. And I'll let him explain it best.
I'm wondering what would be the single most valuable piece of advice you'd give us to even attempt to create some of the value that you guys have done in both your very impressive companies.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing. And it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard. And you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it, you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up, being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society, and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane, right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it? So it's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of worrying constantly. And if you don't love it, you're going to fail. So you got to love it. You got to have passion.
So how many insane people in this room? Lots. Good. Awesome. So another belief that I have is that motivation trumps knowledge. I used to openly admit that I'm a pretty lazy person. I pretty much don't like to do anything that isn't directly related to stuff I enjoy. So I love what I do, so I love to work. I love hanging out with my friends and family. I hate mowing my lawn, cleaning my driveway in Canada, even my laundry. I mean, I just don't do anything. But the motivation side, a lot of people when they're starting companies, they talk about, well, I want to go get experience first. They want to, get an education or whatnot. And, a few years ago, I realized that out of everything that you can do to be successful, that motivation to be successful is probably the most important. After I saved all my money and moved back home to start Spheric Technologies, I had 70 grand in the bank. And I thought, go big or go home. Because I had tried smaller companies in the past, but never really committed. And I figured if I put all my money into it, then I know I'm going to be committed. So day one, I hired 3 guys. 2 guys I worked with before. I pretty much called them up. They were still working at that first company I used to work at, and said, you guys want to come work with me? They both said yes. They were like 23. And then I said, well, who's the smartest guy at the company? I need a third. They said, well, this guy, Andrew. I said, cool. Make the intro. I'll meet with Andrew, and we'll see if he's interested. So we sit down. I meet this guy, Andrew, we have coffee, super sharp, and I offer him the job, and he says yes. So I was like, awesome, 3 people, new company. 2 weeks later, I call up Andrew, I'm going over to his house to drop off the HR, the paperwork that he has to sign, because he resigned, and I go up to the driveway, knock on the door, and when you start a company at that age, I was 24, I thought, at the end of the day, these guys are all young. Who cares? I'd love for it to work out. Obviously, I'm investing my own money and time, and I think there's an idea here. But if it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. We're all young. We've got years to make it up. So I knock on the door of Andrew's house, and all of a sudden, this 3-year-old blonde girl pulls the door open. And I was like, is Andrew here? And she screams out, Daddy. And I was like, okay. So Andrew comes up from downstairs. He's like, hey, Dan, how's it going? Did you meet my little girl, Rhea? And I'm like, yeah, I didn't know you were married, let alone had kids. He goes, yeah, I want you to meet Jill, my wife. And she walks out from the kitchen up the stairs, and here's this woman that's 6 months pregnant. And I was like, oh, shit. Cool, yeah, okay, here's the paperwork, I'm excited. And I can't tell you, as soon as I drove out of his driveway, the sense of, I need to make this work. Not only for the other guys that hired, not only for myself, and obviously I don't want to lose my money, but here's a guy that just quit his job at the best company in the city to work with somebody he didn't know because for some reason he believed in my vision. And there was just this sense of commitment to Andrew, that motivation. So the company starts, we actually had customers, we started doing work, and 3 months into it, I run into a wall. What happened was we did work, so essentially I hire all these employees, I buy them hardware, we travel, we do work with clients. It was a service company. We had companies like Procter & Gamble and Dole Foods as customers, and I thought we were on top of the world. We were doing the work, invoicing, signing contracts, and one day I look at my bank account and essentially I had no money to make payroll. I learned this lesson that my dad, I would never admit to him in person, my dad always told me about cash flow, and I was like, what's cash flow? I've got revenue and sales, and what happened was in a service company, you essentially work with the client, you invoice, so maybe you work for 30 days, 45 days, you invoice, then they have 30 days to pay you if they decide to be on time. Most times they'll take 60 days. And then in my case, I was working with these US companies that once I got the check in the mail, I go to the bank, and they would freeze it for 20 business days. And I was like, this is gonna suck. Like, we're doing good. We have revenue. We have customers. And I can't make payroll. And I was stressing out. And it was that commitment to knowing that the other guys were young. They were going to make it okay. But knowing that Andrew had to feed, a young girl, had a wife, and, and he took a chance on me, I felt committed. And I did what I suggest every entrepreneur do. I picked up the phone and called anybody. And I said, hey, man, here's this issue. And one of my advisors, this guy, John, gave me some great advice, which I didn't even know existed. He says, why don't you factor the receivables? So there's this industry, which I think they're absolutely brilliant for doing this because it's quite interesting. There's this industry called factoring where you can actually get them to buy your invoices, your receivables. You still guarantee them, but they'll essentially take 15% and give you the money today. It's kind of like a business version of, payday loan, right? And I got over the hump because I got this guy that bought my receivables. And the guys on my team never knew. And I think that's one thing most entrepreneurs have to do. Essentially, you have to take it for the team. They never need to know how bad it got because that's not what they signed up for. They look up to you as the leader, and you're supposed to bring that certainty. Even though you're like screaming, let's run into battle, and you know damn well how hard it's going to be, that's not your job to tell them. It's to make sure that they feel confident about what you're about to do. So the company kept going. That was roadblock one. And we did really well. We grew 150% for the first 2 years. And then one day, I took the weekend off. And on Monday, I checked my voicemail. And I get this voicemail from the vice president of one of our companies, pretty much telling me this guy, Nick, that was working with him, was caught by security. This is one of those days where I'm like, why did I sign up for this? Nick no longer works here. We discovered that he was distributing really inappropriate content on our network, and we lost one of our customers due to that, and we were going to be suing for retribution or whatever. And I'm like, what are you talking? I just couldn't believe it. And I call up Nick, and I was like, dude, before I call back this customer, what happened? He goes, man, I screwed up. I'm so sorry. I was like, what happened? He's like, it was Friday. I was talking to my friend on IM. We were talking about going to the strip clubs and what we were going to do and whatever. And then he asked me about my team. I might have said some inappropriate things about the manager. And I guess IT picked it up and reported it to the vice president. So I was like, dude, 2 years of crazy investment trying to make the company work, and I'm getting sued. Essentially, they were going to kill the company. And I was walking around the mall just thinking about what I was going to do, and I was like just pissed off because I'd worked so hard to build this company. I felt like just flipping the table and calling it a day. Like, why is it that this person essentially controlling the outcome? And I call up another mentor. I ask him, what do you think I should do? And he gave me the best advice I ever got, which was get your best suit on and show up at that client's doorstep tomorrow morning. And I was like, what are you talking about? They're in New Jersey. He said, exactly. Get on the plane, show up, 8:30 a.m., sit in the lobby, and tell them this. I'm Dan Martell, the CEO of the company, and I'm here to make it right. And I did that. And you wouldn't believe the guy's face. He was like, well, I have meetings. I can't meet with you. Where are you from? You just flew here from Canada? And I said, look, we screwed up. I want to make it right. And they ended up, it did cost us a lot of money. It cost me about 300 grand. But we didn't get sued. We made it right. And the company eventually got acquired 2 years later. But what I realized out of all of that is sometimes you have to put that personal motivation on yourself to actually overcome it. Some people call it burning the bridges, right? Or essentially making a commitment, declaring to your friends that this is what I'm going to do. But nothing is more important than that motivation. You don't need to know how to do anything the first time you do it. You're just going to be motivated to kind of get through it. So another belief I have is you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. All right, think about that. Think about the people around you if you're here with your coworkers, or think about the people you spend your weekends with. If you're still hanging around with your stoner, drunken, barbecue, partying friends on weekends, and you're not getting the kind of success you would hope for, what can I say? It's really that simple. When I was doing that company Spirit, after I dealt with that near-death experience, there's this moment every year in a service company that pretty much December 1st, nothing gets done till about March, right? Like, everybody goes on vacation, your customers aren't signing any purchase orders because they haven't gotten their budgets figured out. All the people that work for you are essentially partying and enjoying the holidays with your customers. And for me, I'm looking at this spreadsheet of our pipeline going, I just hired these 4 new guys because my goal was growth, and I don't have any work for them. And I was stressed out. And to make it even worse for me, my birthday, so the end of the year, you've got New Year's Eve, which is always that point in your life where you get to reflect on the past year. And my birthday is December 26th. Another point in that year that you get to reflect to see if anything you were doing. And I'm looking at essentially another catastrophe, right? But it was my fault. I was like, oh my gosh, I did it again. I made that decision, I went too far, and this time it's gonna blow up in my face. And out of desperation, because you gotta understand, I grew up in a town of 100,000 people. I didn't have a friend like me. I didn't know anybody that built a tech company or built any interesting company at that age. I was 26. And I thought, who cares if I die? Obviously my parents, well not die, but the company. Who cares if I don't make it through it? And I realized that the minister, because I had created a bunch of jobs. I had 12, 13 people working for me. I figured the minister is gonna care if I don't make it through, so I cold email him on a Saturday night, like 1 in the morning. This guy named Frank McKenna, arguably one of the best ministers. To date, I had to Google who he was because I didn't even know who he was. And I just email him and say, Frank, I'm a young entrepreneur, I have employees, we've built a pretty interesting business, but I'm having some real issues and I don't know how to get through it. Is there anybody like me in the province that you could suggest? And within 45 minutes, and I thought for sure he's enjoying the holiday spirits and there was no way to respond, and within 45 minutes I get an email back from Frank and he says, you gotta meet these 3 people. And I was like, wow, that's cool. So I Googled their names. The first guy is the ex-CEO of the telco of the province. Old guy, 70 years old. I don't know if it's just me, but most 70-year-olds online look really grumpy. You know what I mean? Like, he had this picture and he's like, and I was like, I'm not calling this guy. He's gonna rip my head off. But I knew I had to put my ego out of the way and not act on fear, so I email every one of them, and you'd be surprised, within a day, most of them had responded. This guy, Jerry Pond, who was the ex-CEO, actually gave me a cell phone and said, call him right away. It was almost like they knew. And I don't know in your business or as an entrepreneur if you've ever talked to somebody and you just felt like there was something where they needed to talk to somebody and you had to be there for them. They did. And they were instrumental. I can't tell you how much I owe them everything. Over the next 2 years, my company grew another 150% year over year, got acquired in 2008. And then I called up Jerry and asked him, I really think I should maybe go and see what Silicon Valley is all about. And I was worried because I'd built this company in the province, we won some awards, and I didn't want anybody to think like I was turning my back on this city and this part of the world that I was really passionate about. And he said the best thing you could ever do for this area is go to San Francisco, learn, and bring it back. And that's what I did. 5 years later, with my new company, Clarity, I actually raised a bunch of money from investors and gave them a Canadian Wire account, and they all asked me, they're like, where the hell is this place? I was like, just send the money and I'll circle back. But the 5 people you spend the most time with, you become that average, right? Think about that. It's okay to spend less time with your family if they don't support you or your high school friends, and try to reach out to those entrepreneurs in the community that are doing well or that are doing things that you find interesting. Hustle to help. There's guys like Miha and others like Scott from Charity Water that absolutely embrace this concept that you get what you put out there. You can only keep what you give away. There's a quote by Zig Ziglar that you can accomplish anything in life if you're willing to help others achieve what they're trying to accomplish. And I believe this to the nth degree. And you do it without ever expecting anything back. It's just funny how it just kind of works out. In the magical sentence that I like to ask, and if you've never whispered these words, especially while you're at this conference, you meet somebody and they're super interesting and you love what they're doing. If you don't ask them, how can I be helpful, then you just don't get it. Because that, to me, is what it's all about. It's helping other people without ever expecting anything in return. And in 2007, I was speaking at this conference, And there was I think one of the top entrepreneurs in Canada, this guy named Mike McDermott, who's the founder and CEO of FreshBooks, was speaking there. And as we were walking between sessions, you know, I say, hey, Mike, you know, I'm a big fan. I'm a customer. I really enjoyed your talk. You know, what's new? What's interesting? What's exciting at FreshBooks? And he starts telling me about this new platform they're working on. I said, oh, that's pretty awesome. He's like, yeah, I'm having a bit difficult trying to figure out all the different mechanics. And I said, well, I actually have 2 friends that have built marketplaces. Do you want me to make an intro? And he said, that'd be great, Dan, thanks. So I made the intro. 6 months later, he's putting together a conference and he's involved in it, and he emails me out of the blue and says, Dan, we have this conference coming up in 4 months. We'd love to have you speak there. I was blown away. I said, absolutely, Mike, I'll be there. And so a few weeks prior to the conference, I'm tweeting that I'm going to be there, and if anybody's in the city, you know, hit me up. I want to meet in person. And out of nowhere is this tweet from this beautiful blonde woman comes across my screen. And she's like, hey, Dan, I know you're speaking at the conference. I'd love to sit down and pick your brain. And I was like, yeah, right? I'm single. Absolutely. So anyways, the day of the conference comes by, and we see each other in passing, but there was a lot of people, and I had to go do my thing. And then we said we'd meet up later, and we're at the night event, and I see her kind of walking around the room, and I was just really impressed with her energy. And at the end, when she was about to leave, you know, she said, it's really too bad we didn't get a chance to sit down and talk, but let me know next time you're in town. I would definitely love to kind of talk about what you spoke about. And I said, well, I'm in town for a couple more days. How about we have dinner? And she said, absolutely. So that was cool. Dinner turned into a long-distance relationship that lasted 4 months until I convinced her to move to San Francisco. We lived in San Francisco for the last 2 years, and in the same month, my company Flowtown got acquired, and I asked Renee to be my wife, and she said yes. But wait, the coolest thing that happened is on August 17th of last year, when my son was born, Max, and that's him. Thanks. The crazy part is a week after something happens, and now we're expecting our second 2 weeks before his first birthday. So I used to say we don't fuck around, but Renee said, yes, we do. So, you know, that's just an example of how you don't know how the world's going to end up connecting all these things. But all I know from experience is you have to go out of your way to try to be super helpful, especially to people that inspire you. If you're talking to somebody and what they're working on, if somebody's on stage today and you found what they're speaking about inspiring, ask them how you can be helpful, because you'd be surprised how things come back. So I'm going to end on this story. I told you it's a very personal story of one of the best entrepreneurs I ever met, and it's about my brother Pierre. And this is Pierre. He's actually my younger brother, although most people think he's older because he's missing a bit of hair. And when the day I took this photo, he made me promise I'd never put it on the internet. This was taken like 6 years ago. And the reason why Pierre is one of the most interesting entrepreneurs is, you know, when I was growing up, Pierre was arguably in our family a lot more entrepreneurial than I. You know, I always joke that I started building tree forts when I was 8 and charged people to get into them, so I was kind of in real estate at a very young age. But Pierre actually made some real money when he was like 11 and 12 at flea markets, and by the time he was 13, he bought his first car thinking that he was going to fix it up over a couple of years and have it ready for when he turned 16. Turns out 6 months later, he sells it, makes a profit, buys another car. By the time he turns 16, he's driving a brand new Mustang 5.0. So my parents always thought that Pierre was going to be the entrepreneur, and maybe I'd be the lawyer because I like to argue. But he decides to go to mechanic school, so become a mechanic because of his passion for cars. And, you know, but he always had this aspiration that someday he would own his own shop. So he goes to college, gets his paper. And I always found weird, like, as a mechanic, you go to college, and it's actually a lot harder than becoming a computer programmer. So it's like, I can go to school and get a comp sci degree and then work on, like, NASA spaceships. But he has to, like, go to college for, like, 3 years, then do an apprenticeship and, like, get trained and tested. I always thought that was funny. But Pierre ends up being a mechanic at this place called Ralph's. And you know, I always asked Pierre, I was like, you're going to own your own shop? And he said, well, you know, I talked to Ralph when I first started interning there, and he said someday he was going to retire, and there's a real good opportunity that I can buy it. I was like, cool, when's that gonna happen? He said, oh, probably in about 4 years. Awesome. So the next year rolled around, and Pierre's working there. He's killing himself. He's making things happen. The shop actually grows by double. And Pierre goes to Ralph, and he says, hey, Ralph, you know, we talked about putting something on paper. It's been 2 years. I'd love to kind of figure out what that would look like. And Ralph's like, you know, I'm really busy with the holidays. Let's talk about it afterwards. 12 months go by. And Pierre doesn't want to be too pushy, but he goes, hey, Ralph, you know, we talked about putting this together, the paperwork. I actually talked to my lawyer. I have a draft. And Ralph's like, well, let's talk about it in a few more months. Like, it's like there's a lot of stuff going on in my personal, my wife, et cetera, et cetera. Let's put it off for now. I really appreciate everything you're doing, Pierre, and you know, gives him a bonus. A year goes by, and Pierre finally goes to Ralph and says, dude, it's been 4 years now. I've got the paperwork with me. We need to figure this out. And Ralph looks at him and with a low voice essentially says, I feel really horrible, but things are going so well, I just don't see myself retiring anytime soon. And Pierre goes, I quit. That was the night that I got a call from my brother, and he says, Dan, I need to talk. And I was like, all right, this is weird, he never calls, so meet me at my house, he says. So I drive to his house, pull in his backyard, and he's standing there on his patio. And I'm like, dude, what's going on? He goes, I just quit my job. And I was blown away. I was like, weren't you supposed to buy that shop? He goes, yeah, it's a long story. Anyways, Ralph didn't want to sign the paperwork, so I quit. And I was like, oh, cool, so what are you gonna do now? Buy your own mechanic shop? And he goes, I actually don't like being a mechanic. I was like, it's a good lesson to learn earlier in your career before you almost bought a shop. I said, well, what are you going to do, right? It's like the best question to ask an entrepreneur that just recently got free. I said, what are you going to do? He goes, I don't know, man. And I was like, well, why don't you work? What's the most interesting thing you've done recently you're super passionate about that you would want to do? And he goes, well, I recently helped my friend. For the last 6, 7 weeks, every weekend, my friend was building a new house, and he would pay me in beer, and I would work helping him build his house. And it took us, 7, 8 weeks. And at the end of it, he goes, I really thought it was neat that I helped him build his home, right? The place where he knew he was going to raise his family. I said, well, that's awesome. Why don't you start a home building company? He goes, I don't know anything about building homes. And I go, who gives a shit, man? Nobody does when they start. And that was the day Martell Home Builders was born. So he said, I have no money. And I went in to my laptop bag and wrote a check for everything I had in my bank account, because to me, nothing would have been more exciting than seeing him go after his goals. So I wrote him a check, wished him good luck, and said, I got to get back to work. And Pierre started. And for the next 4 months, he learned as fast as he could. He found a lot, he put a foundation in, and he decided to build 4 houses. Pierre wanted to compete against the market by building the most cost-effective house ever. And he did a good job at that. The thing what he didn't realize in the industry is this thing called curb appeal, which essentially is no matter how cheap the house, if you have a spouse or partner and they don't fall in love with the visual aspect of the house, there's no way you're going to buy it. Like, there's no way that you can convince your partner to buy a house that looks like crap. This is what he actually built. So I get a call from Pierre, and he goes, we need to talk. And I'm like, oh, I know that voice. And I go to his house, and I walk into his back of the house, has a kitchen. I walk in the kitchen, there's no furniture. I was like, okay, am I in the right house? And then kind of was like, Pierre, you here? He's like, yeah, I'm back in my office. So I walk through the kitchen into the living room. I look around, no furniture, no nothing, no sofa. And I scream out, Pierre, I think somebody broke into your house and stole all your shit. He goes, he's like, just come to the office. I don't want to talk about it. I was like, that's weird. So I walk down the hallway. I see Pierre. I take that photo. And I look into his room, and there's nothing in there except for an air mattress and a sleeping bag. And I say, dude, what's going on? And he starts to tell me how bad things had got. He built these houses with no curb appeal and couldn't make the mortgage payments anymore and had to remortgage his own house. And out of desperation, a real estate agent said to him, you might be able to sell these faster if you staged it. And he took everything out of his own house and put it in these model homes. And I didn't know what the heck to do. But At that moment was the time that I realized that you could never ask for a better entrepreneur because he was going to do whatever it took to make it right. So I did the first thing I thought I could do and convinced my littlest brother to buy the first house. True story. I gave him $5,000. I convinced him that home ownership was a good idea, and he, and he bought that one. And then we ended up figuring out how to sell the other ones. But what we did is we essentially asked, I asked him, I was like, what's the problem? He tells me about the fact that nobody wants to buy his homes because they're ugly. And I said, well, why are you building ugly houses? He goes, well, I don't know what to build. And I thought from like customer experience and lean startup, like, why don't you learn from the customer? So what Pierre did is he came up with this really neat idea where he got a bunch of women together, put them in a van, drove them around on a Sunday to all his competitors' homes and asked them to take notes and take photos. And at the end of the day, he took all those women, put them in one of the model homes, gave them cocktails, and he called it customer cocktail hour, and then brought the architect in, and they essentially designed the perfect home. And within a few months, he had built this. Now, you got to understand, as a home builder, the market, on average in North America, the average home builder builds 4 homes a year. Within the first year after building 4 houses that didn't sell, and figuring out the right product, Pierre went on to sell 16 houses in his first year. He really understood who his customer was. He took that even further and said, like, what are the other things that women want? He understood his customers so well that at the trade show, at the home show that year, this was his slogan. He understood that women made the decisions about what house they would build. He started talking to them and tried to understand what are the other frustrations in buying a home with a contractor. He said, well, most people don't understand where their contractor is. They're not answering their phone. So he decided to build this thing called Where's My Contractor? No joke. Real-time GPS and video tracking for everybody that works at his company. You can go on their website and see that in real time. He then said, well, buying a house is the largest financial decision you'll ever make. Instead of getting you a basket of flowers or some fruit and wine when you move into your new house, why don't we give you 2 tickets to jump out of a plane? It turns out that most people talk about it but never do it. So from a marketing point of view, it worked really well. And then he went even further when I remember I called him up and I said, Pierre, I just saw the coolest thing in San Francisco. He said, what's that? I said, pink mustaches for your car. He's like, what would we do with that? I said, you should add them to the front of all your trucks. And he said, dude, I love you, bro, but there's no freaking way. He goes, you don't understand, man. These guys are manly men that swing hammers. They're not going to put big pink mustaches. And I said, why don't we do it for charity? And it worked. And to this date, Pierre's raised tens of thousands of dollars for Run for the Cure. And he's now in his second year. First year, he built 16 houses. Second year, he built 36 houses. The third year, 50. He's now building, 6 years later, over 100 and some homes a year. And every time I see that picture or tell this story, it reminds me that it's never an overnight success. And he has never told the story I just told you guys because he feels ashamed about it. And I can't tell you how proud I am of my brother. So with that, I want to ask one thing from everybody in this room. As an entrepreneur, as a leader in your community, is a commitment to make no small plans. Thanks for having me today.